I think we should start now, Dr. Sonal.
Okay. Good evening, everyone. My name is Dr. Sonal Kaushika, and today I'll be talking about weaning from the ventilator. So, what exactly does weaning means? Weaning is basically withdrawing the ventilatory support, which is the ventilatory support, and it is very different from actually extubating the patient, which is physically removing the endotracheal tube from the mouth. So, this is basically just the transferring work of breathing from the ventilator to the patient. And it is a complete protocol which we have to follow before actually extubating the patient later. So, what is the classification of weaning? Weaning is classified as simple weaning, in which the patient is weaned off from the ventilator in the initial 72 hours of intubation and gets successfully extubated in the first attempt of the spontaneous breathing trial. So, approximately 60 to 70% of patients are usually weaned off by simple weaning. Then we have difficult weaning. So in these category of patients, they usually fail the initial weaning trial and they require multiple spontaneous breathing trials up to 7 days for the successful weaning from the mechanical ventilation. About 20 to 25% of the patients come in this category. And the third category of patients come in the prolonged weaning, in which the patient fails more than three spontaneous breathing trial and require more than 7 days from the first spontaneous breathing trial to achieve successful weaning from the mechanical ventilation. And approximately 5 to 15 of the patients comprise of these prolonged weaning. So simple weaning is not something which we are concerned about. The problem is with the ones in which it is difficult weaning and the prolonged weaning, and how do we have to deal with them? So we should have at least some sort of robust ICU weaning protocols and we should follow them stringently. So we'll be discussing about them in details today. So why do the patient fail the spontaneous breathing trial? We have to understand what is the basic problem behind that. So any patient, whenever we put them on a spontaneous breathing trial, they actually land up with respiratory failure. So primarily it can be a lung failure or a pump failure. So whenever there is a lung failure, that will lead to hypoxemia or a type 1 respiratory failure, which can be because of the lung parenchymal disease like ARDS or cardiogenic pulmonary edema, pneumonia, COVID-19 pneumonia, interstitial lung disease. So anything which is related to the lung. Whereas in the pump failure, the patient will have hypercapnia along with hypoxemia, which is a type 2 respiratory failure. And it can be because of various conditions like CNS depression, because of excessive sedatives, or maybe because of some CNS insult due to a recent stroke or some trauma. And it can be because of respiratory muscle weakness or fatigue, like in neuromuscular disorders, Guillain-Barré syndrome. So in those kind of conditions, and even in hypercapnic chronic conditions like COPD, so these patients will have pump failure. So primarily we should be able to identify whenever a patient is failing a weaning trial, whether it is a lung failure or it is a pump failure. So every patient who is on a mechanical ventilator should always undergo a daily wean screen, and we should give a spontaneous breathing trial to them based on their various parameters. So this is the assessment checklist. The first and the primary condition is that their underlying lung condition with which they were admitted and they got intubated, the ventilator support should be stable. The underlying lung pathology should be improving. They should be hemodynamically stable. There should be no evidence of shock, or maybe they should be on minimum pressors. There should be adequate oxygenation with PF ratio more than 200. FiO2 should be less than 50%, zero point 0.5, and PEEP should be around 5 to 8 centimeters of water. Then, in your ABGs, there should be evidence of adequate ventilation and acid base balance with pH of more than 7.3, and PCO2 should be less than 50 at the baseline. They should have adequate respiratory effort. So the RSBI, which is has to be less than 105 breaths per minute per liter, which is your rapid shallow breathing index. So that is measured by the respiratory rate divided by the tidal volume. And in this, the tidal volume we have to convert from milliliters to liters. Then the patient should have adequate mental status. They should be conscious, oriented, responding to commands. GCS should be at least more than 8, and RAS should be between 0 to -1. So they should not be very agitated, and at the same time, they should not be very drowsy and difficult to get up. So whenever a patient has an adequate mental status, they will be able to protect their airway. Then they should be able to manage their secretion. They should have an adequate or an effective cough reflex. So to see the cough reflex or the cough, the potential, we measure the cough peak flow, which has to be at least more than 60 liters per minute, especially in the neurological patients, and it has to be more than 160 liters per minute in the normal patients. The non-neurological patients who are on some kind of an artificial airway, like an endotracheal tube or a tracheostomy. So how do we measure this? So this is how a peak cough flow meter looks like. It is a small device which gets attached to the end of your endotracheal tube or a tracheostomy tube, and you ask the patient to cough. And whenever a patient coughs, so the flow of air is detected by this device, and that should be at least more than 60 liters per minute. Then the neuromuscular function we have to assess. Patient should be able to initiate the spontaneous breathing effort or the spontaneous inspiratory effort. So that is basically denoted by the maximum inspiratory pressure or the negative inspiratory flow, the force, and that is which is seen on the ventilator. So how is it seen? We'll just see a small video.
This is how we measure maximum inspiratory pressure or negative inspiratory force in a patient undergoing assisted mechanical ventilation. We ask the patient to make inspiratory efforts while we hold the expiratory.
Are you able to see the video?
No, Dr.
No,
Sonal.
ma'am, just the audio.
I think you have to click on that link, Sonal, that YouTube link that you've.
No, I've clicked the link only, but in this it is showing that the
We can hear the audio, but we can't see the video.
okay. Are you able to see?
This is how we measure maximum inspiratory.
Now are you able to
It's still the audio, I guess. Yeah.
but it is showing that the screen is
You
sharing.
need to screen share. You need to screen share again. Like go to the YouTube place. And when you click the
Okay.
YouTube link, the video, then screen share that.
Now are you able to see?
Yes, ma'am.
Yes, ma'am.
Yeah. Now try and play it. It'll work.
This is how we measure maximum inspiratory
Yeah,
pressure
it's visible now.
or negative inspiratory force in a patient undergoing assisted mechanical ventilation. We ask the patient to make inspiratory efforts while we hold the expiratory pause button for 20 or 30 seconds. After this time, we save. After a minute or so, we can enter the menu to check the saved waveforms. We go back looking for the maximum pressure drop during the expiratory hold. Maximum inspiratory pressure is the difference between total PEEP and the maximum negative pressure drop, 34 in this case.
So this is how we measure the maximum inspiratory pressure.
Ma'am, can you please explain it again?
Do you want to see the video again?
No, I just want a simple explanation from you, ma'am, please.
Yeah, just give me a moment to close the presentation. Yeah, so what we basically, the negative inspiratory force or the maximum inspiratory pressure is the negative pressure, which basically tells us the amount of negative pressure patient is able to initiate at the time of the inspiration. So basically what we do, we press the expiratory hold in the ventilator so that there is no flow at that point of time. And then we tell the patient, we see the inspiratory effort of the patient at that point of time. So the more the negative, the better it is. It has to be actually less than -20 to 30 for be able to wean the patient from the ventilator. Did you understand?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. So, to look at the neuromuscular functions, we look at the maximum inspiratory pressure or the negative inspiratory flow. Then the second thing which we look at is the airway occlusion pressure at 0.1 second or
Ma'am,
uh,
we can't see the content.
Yeah.
It's Zoom, it's coming Zoom window.
I think I'll have to share again.
Now it's visible.
Okay. So, for the neuromuscular function, we see the inspiratory effort, which I told, it is the maximum inspiratory pressure or the negative inspiratory flow. The second thing which we look at is the P0.1, which is your airway occlusion pressure at 0.1 second or 100 millisecond. It has to be between 1.5 to 3.5. So that is usually seen in the ventilator. And I think if I again click on the link, so I will again have to share the screen. That will be a difficulty, I guess. No, I'll just do it like this. Are you able to see?
This is how we measure P01.
Are you able to see the screen?
No, ma'am.
No, ma'am.
Mm. But here it is saying that I'm sharing the screen. You're not able to see the video?
No, ma'am.
Okay, forget it. Are you able to see this screen?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. I think every time I'll have to switch the screen if I have to play the video. So that will be a difficult thing, I guess. We'll just concentrate on the presentation. We'll share the link for the videos in the group. So the airway occlusion pressure has to be between 1.5 to 3.5. If your airway occlusion pressures are less than 1.5, that means a patient has a decreased respiratory drive or a low respiratory drive. And if the patient has more than 3.5, that means patient has a very high respiratory drive. So patient is making a lot of efforts to initiate the breath. So this occlusion pressure at 0.01 is basically an involuntary effort of the patient because it is just at the beginning of the inspiration. So this is not a voluntary breath which is taken by the patient, and that basically denotes the respiratory drive and the inspiratory effort of the patient. Then we do the lung ultrasound to determine the diaphragm thickness fraction, which has to be more than 30 to 35%. So basically to determine the diaphragm thickness fraction, we measure the diaphragm thickness at inspiration and expiration. Usually in normal patients, at the inspiration, the diaphragm thickness increases 2 to 3 times of the normal, which is at the deep inspiration. And at the expiration, which is at rest, it is usually around 1.5 to 3.5 mm. So for diaphragmatic thickness fraction, we actually minus the inspiratory thickness with the expiratory thickness, divide by the expiratory thickness, and we multiply it by 100. You can find these formulas online easily. And then we also look at the diaphragmatic exertion, which basically means the movement of the diaphragm with inspiration and expiration. And that has to be more than 10 to 14 mm. So the more the movement, the better is the function of the diaphragm. And if the diaphragmatic exertion is less than 10, that means there is diaphragmatic palsy or diaphragmatic paralysis or patient will not be able to, patient will go into weaning failure. And now instead of RSBI, we use DERSBI, which is your diaphragmatic exertion RSBI, and that should be less than 1.3 to 1.6. So basically, instead of using tidal volume, we are using respiratory rate divided by the diaphragmatic exertion. So why we use diaphragmatic exertion is because that is the direct measure of the diaphragmatic function instead of just relying on the tidal volumes, which is an indirect measure. So we actually had videos for all of these, but I think it is not working. So we'll share the links. And then daily sedation vacation. So the most important thing is that RSBI, which is the rapid shallow breathing index, is the most consistent predictor of weaning success. And every day, whenever we are doing an RSBI, we should always see the trend analysis, whether RSBI is improving or it is deteriorating. So next thing we talk about is the weaning path, which is basically a 3-step liberation process. And in this, it consists of ready weaning, ready breathing, and ready extubation. So the first step, which is ready weaning, basically looks for the readiness of the patient and screen for whether we can be able to wean the patient. So whenever a patient has the reversal of the cause of respiratory failure, when the patient is confident, GCS is more than 8, patient.
Dr. Sonal, 1 minute. Dr. Chetan, can you mute yourself, please?
Okay.
Thank you. Please carry on.
So we start with weaning whenever the reversal of the underlying cause of respiratory failure is there. Patient is conscious and oriented with GCS of at least more than 8. Patient is spontaneously breathing. The PF ratios are more than 200 and patient is hemodynamically stable. And whenever all these criteria are met, we go on to the second step, which is ready breathing. So in this, we basically look at these parameters along with other things in which the patient is able to cough. The saturations are more than 90% on FiO2 of less than 0.4. Patient is not tachypnic. Our respiratory rate is less than 35. The PEEP should be less than 8 and RSBI index should be less than 105. So whenever these parameters are met, that means we can plan for a spontaneous breathing trial. And whenever the patient successfully goes through the spontaneous breathing trial for at least 30 to 120 minutes, then we go on to the third step, which is plan for extubation or ready extubation. So if all these parameters are met and patient successfully goes through the spontaneous breathing trial, we assess for the airway readiness. And just before extubation, we have to perform a cuff leak test. And then we have to go ahead with extubation. So spontaneous breathing trials we can give with either pressure support ventilation or a TPS trial. And this is again a flow chart of how we go about the weaning trial. We do the daily assessment for spontaneous breathing trial. We look for the clinical stability, adequate mentation, adequate oxygenation, adequate pulmonary function. And if the patient meets all these readiness criteria, then we begin with the CPAP of 5 for 3 minutes and we look for the RSBI. If the patient does not meet the readiness criteria, we resume to the appropriate ventilator settings and we allow the patient to rest for 24 hours. If the RSBI is less than 105, we can go ahead with the spontaneous breathing trial. We can either do it with a CPAP, pressure support ventilation, or a TPS trial with 10 liters per minute of oxygen. If the RSBI is more than 105, after beginning with CPAP, then we again have to go back to the previous ventilator settings. If the patient is able to tolerate the spontaneous breathing trial for at least 30 minutes to up to 120 minutes, then we consider it as a successful spontaneous breathing trial. And at this point, we perform the cuff leak test to look for any airway obstruction, because then that can lead to post-extubation stridor. And if the successful spontaneous breathing trial fails, then we again have to go back to the appropriate ventilator settings. And if the cuff leak test is negative, then we go ahead with the extubation. I had a very good video on the cuff leak test. I don't know how do I have to play this.
Every time you are selling clothes in your WhatsApp groups, remember, you are not just sharing a product.
Okay.
Okay, I'll just share my screen once. Are you able to see this?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay.
Today, a member on the channel asked a very interesting question. I would say important question. What is cuff leak test and when it is done and what is the importance? Basically, cuff leak test is used to predict the possibility of post-extubation stridor. Suppose your patient is on the ventilator and you are planning and you have extubated the patient. So how are the chances that this patient will develop post-extubation stridor? So we do this in those patients. Is it done in every patient? Usually we don't do in every patient, but in those patients in which there is a long-term ventilation, 3, 4, 5, 6 days, and there are chances that this patient may develop laryngeal edema or post-extubation stridor. In those patients, we do that. So what happens basically in this cuff leak test? Normally, we have an endotracheal or a tracheostomy tube, and the cuff is inflated around the endotracheal tube. So it seals the tracheal wall. Let's see. Dr. Prerna, can you come here? So what happens? You see here, this is your trachea and this is the endotracheal tube and the cuff is inflated. Now what happens in inspiration, obviously the air will come from here, but during expiration, whatever the air which is going from the trachea is going through this endotracheal tube. Because the cuff has sealed the area, no air will leak from here. So this is a normal condition. Now when you deflate this cuff, what should happen? Whatever the expiratory volume is going there now, along with getting exited through this endotracheal lumen, it should always leak through the side walls of the endotracheal tube. So your ventilator will sense that it has not received full expiratory tidal volume. So suppose you have tidal volume set of 500. Now, when you deflate the cup, because the expiratory tidal volume air has leaked, so it will sense that the expiratory limb is detecting only 300, 350 because that air has leaked. Now, what happens if the patient develops laryngeal edema or there is a tracheal stenosis? When you deflate the cuff also, the air cannot leak from the side of the tube because it will get obstructed here and the air will again go through this endotracheal lumen. So the ventilator will not sense the leak because all the expiratory tidal volume is getting exhaled through this endotracheal lumen. So whenever there is an edema or tracheal stenosis, there will be no leak. Means there will not be very much difference between the inspiratory and the expiratory limb. Just a second. So how we'll do this test? So what you do first, when the cuff is inflated, you observe the given tidal volume and the exhaled tidal volume. So the cuff is inflated and you are ventilating the patient, and then you see what is the tidal volume coming. Record the tidal volume. Now you deflate the cuff and wait for 6 to 10 cycles so that it averages over a period of time. Now there will in a normal patient there will be leak. There will be leak because the air will leak from the side walls. So what ventilator will say that the expiratory tidal volume will show a leak. It will come around 300, 350 like that. But suppose now if there is a tracheal stenosis or laryngeal edema, it will not leak. So what will happen? The expiratory tidal volume here will come again. We have said 500, so it will come 450, 500 or 420. So there will be not enough leak, and this will predict that this patient has chances of laryngeal stenosis or tracheal edema, and this can develop post-extubation stridor. So how much should be the difference? So if the leak of the air is less than 110 ml, means if 110 ml volume is not able to leak from the side of the endotracheal tube, or 10%. If 500 is the tidal volume which we are giving, if it is less than 50. So these are the two cutoffs. So we take 110 ml as the criteria. In pediatric, they take as 10%. So if less than 110 ml leak is there, means if the tidal volume is not dropping below, difference is not more than 110 ml, then we call as cuff leak test positive, and this predicts the chances of post-extubation stridor. So what you should do in such cases, if your cuff leak test comes positive, then you should not extubate this patient, give steroids or anti-edema measures, wait for 24 hours or 48 hours, depending on the clinical situation, repeat the cuff leak test, and now if you find now its cuff leak test is negative, then it is safe to extubate this patient at this stage. So hope this clarifies. Thank you, Dr. Prerna, with me. She is there recording this video. And
So basically in cuff leak test, if the cuff leak is positive, that doesn't means that there is leak of the air from the cuff. That actually means that there is a chances of post extubation stridor. So that is the catch here. So actually to be able to successfully, are you able to see the screen?
Yes, ma'am.
Yeah, so be able to successfully extubate the patient, the cuff leak test actually has to be negative, and then we are safe to extubate the patient.
Ma'am, during the cuff leak test, we have to again put the patient on ventilator on the volume control or assisted control or positive breathing trial control.
No, we have already given the spontaneous breathing trial, and just before extubating the patient, we are performing the cuff leak test. So patient is already on the spontaneous breathing trial. The only thing is that if the cuff leak test is positive, that means there is some sort of obstruction in the airway, maybe some laryngeal edema, and then that can lead to post-extubation stridor. So we have already initiated the spontaneous breathing trial in this patient. Patient has already succeeded in the spontaneous breathing trial, and this is a step which we do just before extubating the patient.
Thank you, ma'am.
Okay. So this is also a very important step just before extubating a patient. We should always do risk stratification for extubation. And why is it important is it lets us plan for the oxygen therapy or the mode of oxygen, how we have to further plan after extubating the patient. So these are some of the risk factors which may lead to extubation failure. The presence of comorbidities and history, if the age is more than 65, if the cause of intubation is heart failure, if patient has moderate to severe COPD, Charlson's comorbidity index is more than 1. So Charlson's comorbidity index is basically an index which tells us about the long-term 10-year mortality in patients. It basically scores around 17 to 19 parameters, and if that index is more than 1, so that again is a risk factor for extubation failure. Now, if the patient has an Apache of more than 12 on the extubation day, are chances that patient may have extubation failure. If the patient is on mechanical ventilation, invasive mechanical ventilation for more than 7 days, if BMI is more than 30, so that means patient is already obese. And in the airway assessment, if there are upper airway related risk factors, that means patient has laryngeal edema, the cuff leak test is positive, or there are excessive thick secretions or excessive secretions which are blocking the airway. Patient has had aspiration of more than 2 episodes within last 8 hours. Patient has initially failed the spontaneous breathing trial and development of hypercapnia and the end of spontaneous breathing trial. So if any of these risk factors are present, so that means that patient has some risk of extubation failure. So depending on these risk factors and the presence or absence of these risk factors, we classify them as low risk, intermediate risk, and high risk. So low risk means patients are without the any risk factors present. In intermediate risk, patient has less than 3 risk factors, but excluding your BMI more than 30 and hypercapnia at the end of spontaneous breathing trial. So obesity and hypercapnia at the end of SBT is itself is a high risk category. So in high risk patients, if patient has more than 4 risk factors present, along with obesity and patient develops hypercapnia at the end of spontaneous breathing trial, then those patients are considered as high risk. So before extubating the patient, we have to go through what are the comorbidities present, what are the risk factors present, and how we are going to deal with them after extubating the patient. So if the patient is of the low risk category, we just have to go ahead with the spontaneous breathing trial. If the patient is of the intermediate risk category, we have to do an aggressive screening. And if the patient is of the high risk category, we have to do a conservative screening. So basically, the difference between aggressive screening and conservative screening is just the physiological thresholds, which we can see here. They are the physiological thresholds which determines the readiness for the spontaneous breathing trials. In aggressive screening, the thresholds are a little on the higher side because in this patient, they have a relatively less risk as compared to the high risk patients, and the intermediate risk patients are in between. So the goal for these patients is actually to extubate them, to encourage to extubate them, and then how do we deal with them after extubation. So that is why we have a higher thresholds. With PF ratio of more than 180, we have FiO2 of around 50%, which is acceptable, even if the patient has PEEP of around 10. So these are acceptable parameters on which we can think of performing a spontaneous breathing trial. Whereas in the high risk category patients, the thresholds has to be very low. Why? Because these are already high risk patients. The goal in this patient is basically to delay extubation so that they do not have premature failing of the spontaneous breathing trial. So whenever these criteria are met, we go ahead with the spontaneous breathing trial. It can be with pressure support of 5, PEEP of 0, or maybe pressure support of 8 to 10 with PEEP of 5, whatever is suitable. And whenever we perform the spontaneous breathing trial, only two things can happen. Patient will succeed in the spontaneous breathing trial, or patient will fail the spontaneous breathing trial. So whenever a patient is intubated and is undergoing treatment for the primary lung condition, so it has a wide spectrum from the time of intubation to the weaning to undergo a spontaneous breathing trial and successful extubation. And even after extubation, whether the patient is maintaining without the invasive mechanical ventilation for at least 48 hours and is not getting reintubated. So that is the wide spectrum which we have to look at. So once we have given a spontaneous breathing trial and patient succeeds with that, so in patients with low risk category where there are no risk factors present, we can go ahead with the high flow oxygen therapy. So we can extubate them and put them straight away on oxygen masks. In patient who are with intermediate risk, so and they have the successful spontaneous breathing trial, we can give them a combination of NIV and oxygen therapy. So NIV can be your ventilator NIV, or it can be your HFNC. Nowadays HFNC has also come up in the form of non-invasive ventilation. But in the high risk category, if the patient succeeds the spontaneous breathing trial, they have to be conditioned to NIV. There is no chances of combination therapy. We have to at least give them the NIV for initial 24 to 48 hours to prevent reintubation or to reduce the chances of reintubation. Now, if the patient has failed the spontaneous breathing trial, this is a very gray area. Ideally, we should not go ahead with the extubation, but there are certain categories of patient in which we extubate them to facilitated NIV. What does that mean is any patient who has chronic hypercapnia, like in specifically COPD patients, so they will always fail the spontaneous breathing trial, because if you give them spontaneous breathing trial for a longer duration, there will be resistance exerted by the endotracheal tube. There will be other parameters because their physiology is altered. They have the tendency to go into CO2 retention because of the intrinsic auto PEEP. So in these category of patients specifically, we can go ahead with the extubation with conditioned NIV, which means that after extubation, we have to 100% put them on NIV support. And after extubation for at least next 48 hours, we have to observe whether your patient maintains without the invasive mechanical ventilation. If the patient is maintaining, that is considered as successful extubation. But at any point of time, if patient is requiring reintubation, that is considered as a weaning failure. So these are some of the clinical trials which has been done, which tells us about something post-extubation respiratory support. So these are the studies which has discussed about the prophylactic NIV and HFNC, specifically in the high-risk patients category. So the first one was a Ferrer et al., which was done in 2009. It was a randomized, landmark randomized control trial, which compared prophylactic NIV versus the standard oxygen therapy in 106 high-risk patient, and the outcome was a significantly reduced reintubation rates from 32% to 7%. So it basically encourages us to use prophylactic NIV in high-risk patients. The second was a Hernandez et al.'s study, which was done in 2016, which compared the use of HFNC versus NIV in low to moderate risk patients. And the outcome was that HFNC was not non-inferior to NIV. That means both of them were comparable, superior for comfort and tolerance. So HFNC is definitely more comfortable and more tolerable. Reintubation similarly low. So in both the categories, the reintubation rates were significantly low. In 2019, it was a HIVEEN trial, which was a large multi-center RCT, and they studied about the prophylactic NIV plus HFNC alternating versus just HFNC alone, especially in the high-risk category patients, including COPD and heart failure. And the outcome was that the combined strategy significantly reduced the 7-day reintubation rates from 18.2 to 11.8%. So overall, the study tells us that the prophylactic supports is crucial in the high risk group. Whenever we find that patient, high risk group means that patient has more than 4 risk factors present. They are obese, they develop hypercapnia at the end of spontaneous breathing trial. So we should always extubate them on NIV. It can be NIV, HFNC, but they are pressing on no longer NIV versus HFNC. It can be NIV plus HFNC. Use NIV for hypercapnia, HFNC for hypoxemia, and secretion clearance. So this is what we discussed about in the initial slides when we talked about that whenever a patient fails a weaning trial or a spontaneous breathing trial, we have to assess whether it is a lung failure or it is a pump failure. Patient has hypoxemia or patient has hypoxemia plus hypercapnia. And that is how we decide the strategy of extubation and post-extubation treatment therapy options. So these evidences support use of prophylactic NIV HFNC strategies immediately after extubation for high-risk patient to reduce the treatment failure. Now, the important takeaway point in this is that these are only the rescue therapies, both NIV and HFNC. They are not the alternative therapies for intubation. At any point of time, if the patient clinically deteriorates or patient develops any hemodynamic instability, we always have to go ahead with reintubation. We should never think that we have to wait. We can try with HFNC, we can try with NIV, and we can just wait and linger on. No, they are just they are just rescue therapies. If the patient is maintaining on them, well and good. If patient is not maintaining on them and is not improving, we straight away have to go ahead with reintubation. So weaning can be success if there is absence of ventilatory support for more than 48 hours following extubation. And it is a failure if there are failure of multiple spontaneous breathing trials or patient gets reintubated within 48 hours post-extubation. And 15% of the patients comes into this category where they gets reintubated within 48 hours of extubation. So what are the different criteria for failure of spontaneous breathing trial? Whenever we put a patient on the spontaneous breathing trial, there can be abnormalities in their oxygenation, on their ventilator, acid-base balance. There can be problems with the respiratory effort and cardiovascular instability. So patient may develop hypoxemia, PaO2 can go below 60 with increased FiO2 requirement of more than 50%. Patient may have low saturations of less than 90% with more than 50% of FiO2. They may develop hypercapnia with PCO2 of more than 50, and any increase in PCO2 of more than 8 mmHg from the baseline of spontaneous breathing trial is considered as hypercapnia at the end of SBT. If the patient has pH less than 7.32 or a decrease in pH of more than 0.07 from baseline of spontaneous breathing trial, then that is called as a respiratory acidosis. Then the patient's RSBI index has to be less than 105. If the RSBI index is more than 100, it is a poor respiratory effort, or the patient develops tachypnea with respiratory rate of more than 35 or increase in more than 50% from the baseline of spontaneous breathing trial. In cardiovascular instability, patient develops tachycardia with heart rate of more than 140, or there is an increase of more than 20% from the baseline of SBT. Patient has high BP with systolic BP more than 180 or increase in BP by more than 20% from the baseline, or patient develops hypotension where systolic blood pressure goes down below 90, and any presence of cardiac arrhythmias. So whenever we put a patient on a spontaneous breathing trial and patient has these kind of instabilities, that is where we consider it as a failure of spontaneous breathing trial. So what can be the broadly causes of weaning failure? Broadly, it is classified into 3 categories. there can be either increased airflow resistance, or there can be decrease in the lung compliance, or there can be respiratory muscle fatigue. So let's see what are they. So these are some of the causes which can lead to increased airflow resistance. Maybe the size of the ET tube is small. There are multiple attached devices like the HME filter or the continuous suction catheter or the ETCO2 monitoring probe. And these get clogged because of the humidification or secretion. So they can basically increase your airflow resistance. Kinking of the ET tubes, there are obstruction in the ET tube by the secretions or the mucus plug, or patient has bronchospasm. So whenever any of these causes are present, we have to look into them, and these are the potential causes of your weaning failure. The second category is decreased lung compliance. So basically, we should know what is lung compliance. Lung compliance is the stretchability of the lung, and it is basically your change in volume with change in pressure. So there are two types of compliance. One is a static compliance, which is denoted by the dotted line, and the other is a dynamic compliance, which is denoted by your inspiration and the expiration curve. So what is the major difference between the static compliance and the dynamic compliance is that static compliance is usually measured when there is no airflow. So basically, in that condition, it only reflects the elastic properties of the lung and the chest wall. So how do we do that? We basically press the inspiratory hold button on the ventilator, and at that point of time, when there is no airflow during the inspiration, that is the time which tells us about the static compliance of the lung, and it is reflected by the plateau pressures in the ventilator. Usually it has to be less than 30. Whereas the dynamic compliance is basically the compliance or the stretchability of the lung at the normal breathing. That means at the normal inspiration and expiration. And it reflects both the elasticity of the lung as well as the airway resistance. So that is denoted by the peak inspiratory pressure in your ventilatory curves. So whenever there are different conditions, there will be decreased lung compliance. In static compliance, the different lung conditions which basically affects your small airways and the alveoli, like atelectasis, ARDS, pneumonia, tension pneumothorax, obesity, or there are some retained secretions in the lungs. So whenever there will be these conditions are present, there will be decrease in the static compliance. So how will you come to know that the static compliance of the lung is decreased? When you do the inspiratory hold, there will be increased plateau pressures along with the peak inspiratory pressures. Whereas whenever the dynamic compliance decreases because of the bronchospasm or the kinking of the tubes or airway obstructions and retained secretions, there will be only increased peak airway pressures, whereas the plateau pressures will remain normal. So that is the key difference between the static compliance and the dynamic compliance. So any of these clinical conditions will lead to your decreased lung compliance, and that will potentially cause weaning failure. Now, respiratory muscle fatigue can be because of various reasons: decreased lung compliance and increased airway flow resistance. There can be a respiratory muscle dysfunction and diaphragmatic atrophy because we talked about that the patient has low respiratory drive. So in those patients, or maybe the patient has diaphragmatic palsy, in those patients, the diaphragm may go into atrophy. Then mechanical ventilation induced oxidative stress causes contractile dysfunction. There will be inadequate oxygen delivery, insufficient nutrition. So nutrition plays a very important role for weaning of the patients. Electrolyte imbalances like hypokalemia, hypomagnesemia, hypophosphatemia, all these electrolytes. So we have to correct all the electrolytes before weaning the patient. And how do we treat this condition? So every day we have to give a spontaneous breathing trial, which can be intermittent pressure support ventilation or a TPS trial. So these things will basically prevent your respiratory muscle fatigue. How do we manage weaning failure? So to manage weaning failure, as I already told you in the beginning, we have to have strict protocol-based weaning. Spontaneous breathing trial should be performed once daily. We always should identify what are the weaning barriers, and we should try to reverse them as much as possible, and early tracheostomy for a prolonged ventilation. So what is a protocol-based weaning? We have discussed this protocol already, but we will be again pressing on them because it is very important. First, we have to see the readiness for the spontaneous breathing trial, evidence for the reversal of the underlying cause of respiratory failure. Patient is awake and alert, cooperative. There is adequate oxygenation, hemodynamically stable with no or minimal pressures. Patient is afebrile and your pH PCO2 is appropriate for the patient's baseline. If all these parameters are met, you can go ahead with the spontaneous breathing trial. If no, you have to continue with the same mechanical ventilator settings. You can give the spontaneous breathing trial using a CPAP, PSV, or a TPs for 30 to 60 minutes up to 120 minutes. And we have to now assess whether the patient is tolerating the spontaneous breathing trial or not. These are the various factors we have discussed. RSBI index, gas exchange is adequate, patient's respiratory rate is stable, patient is hemodynamically stable, there is no significant change in mental status, there is no evidence of anxiety or agitation, there is no diaphoresis or signs of increased work of breathing, which is use of accessory muscles or any paradoxical breathing. If everything is okay, you can go ahead and see whether the patient is ready to be extubated. So, like we already discussed, it is a 3-step process. Then we have to assess for the airway patency. We have to see whether the patient is able to protect the airway or not, and whether the patient is able to clear his or her secretions. If yes, we perform a cuff leak test and go ahead with the extubation. If no, we have to continue with the previous ventilator settings. Now, these are your weaning barriers which may hinder a successful weaning outcomes. Their patient's pathophysiological conditions like new onset fever or any infection, patient develops AKI or renal failure, goes into sepsis, septic shock, or patient is sleep deprived. So these conditions, they are all reversible conditions. We have to think about them and then possibilities of reversing them. In cardiac and circulatory system, patient may develop arrhythmias, high or low BP, patient will have low or high cardiac output. They may have fluid imbalances, anemia and dysfunctional hemoglobins, and acid-base abnormalities, nutritional deficit, caloric deficits, electrolyte imbalances. So these are all the factors which are your weaning barriers, and we always have to try to reverse them before weaning the patient. And this is the crux of the entire session today, which is very beautifully given in the Washington Manual also. This is a good mnemonic, which is weans now, and it covers everything which we have to look for before weaning the patient. The first and foremost thing is we have to look for the weaning parameters. The underlying pathology has to be reversed. Patient should be hemodynamically stable, conscious oriented. We have to look at the endotracheal tube, the size of the tube, the position of the tube. There should not be any kinking or anything. We have to look at the ABG analysis. The acid-base balance should be normal. The pH should be within the normal range. There should be no hypercapnia, no hypoxemia. The nutritional status of the patient, the secretions, there should be very minimal secretions, or patient should be able to clear the airway or handle the secretions. The neuromuscular factors, obstruction of the airways, there should be no mucus plugging or kinking of the airways, and wakefulness. Patient should be conscious oriented with GCS more than 8 and RAS of 0 to -1. So with this, we go on to the clinical cases. We quickly discuss the clinical cases, and in the end, if anybody has any doubts, we can discuss. So this will be an interactive one. So case 1 is a 78-year-old male, case of diabetes, hypertension, COPD, CKD, IHD status post PTCA, presents with complaints of cough with dyspnea on exertion since 4 to 5 days, and breathlessness since 1 day. So on initial presentation, patient is tachycardic, tachypneic, patient is hypoxic with saturation of 82% on room air. On auscultation, patient has audible V's with bilateral basal creps. He is afebrile and patient has RBS of 246. So initially we managed with oxygen support, nebulization, bronchodilators. We gave antibiotics and diuretics. Patient did not improve, so we initiated with NIV support and patient was shifted to ICU. So these were the initial blood investigations. Patient had leukocytosis, CRP was high, creatinine was high. So this patient had underlying CKD, but now develops acute on CKD. And in the ABGs, there is some evidence of mixed acidosis, including respiratory as well as metabolic. Primarily looks like metabolic with lactates of 2.4. 2D echo was done because patient had an history of ISD status post PTCA. 2D echo was fairly okay. Chest X-ray was done, which showed patchy opacities in bilateral lower zones with both CP angles blunted. So he had some evidence of pneumonia with bilateral pleural effusions. So in the ICU, we managed with antibiotics, diuretics, antacids, nebulization, antiplatelets, antihypertensives, NIV support. But over a period of time, patient clinically worsens with worsening respiratory failure. So he was intubated and put on ventilator support. These were the initial ventilatory settings on volume control with tidal volume of 400, rate of 16, PEEP of 6, and FiO2 of 100% initially. Fentanyl infusion for sedation. Now on day 2, patient becomes hypotensive, started on vasopressors, CVP line was secured, chest X-ray showed increased patchy opacities in bilateral lower zones, antibiotics were escalated. Then he developed decreased urine output, became anuric, so nephrologist reference was done. Serum albumin was around 1.8, patient undergoes hemodialysis with albumin. So overall, this patient is a COPD patient with history of IHD, now develops bilateral pneumonia, has worsening respiratory failure, goes into septic shock, develops AKI, acute on CKD, goes on dialysis. So this is a picture of a multi-organ failure. So over next 48 hours, the patient improves. This is the CBC. The leukocytosis improves, WBC count comes down, creatinine improves from 6.2 to 4.1. After dialysis, patient had hypokalemia, potassium of 2.8, so we replaced potassium. ABG was fairly okay. So now what do you think? Should we go ahead with the spontaneous breathing trial? Should we give a weaning trial at this stage?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay.
Yes, ma'am.
Anybody who doesn't want to give weaning trial and wants to wait?
If patient meets all the winning criteria, we should give the spontaneous breathing trial.
Yeah, so according to the parameters which are given here, it looks that patient has improved and goes through the weaning criteria.
Yes.
So on day 5, so these are actual cases of my ICU, and these are the practical realities what we face in the ICU. So despite of ticking all the ticks in the checklist, we gave a weaning trial to the patient. We put him on the pressure support ventilation, but somehow patient failed. And same day, patient develops fever spikes. So we have sent an ET culture. We again did a hemodialysis with 2 kg negative balance. And on day 6, basically, we had given a break for 24 hours. We did an HRCT thorax to see what is the basic lung condition. So it showed patchy areas of consolidation in bilateral zones, posterior basal regions. There are small cavities in the anterior and posterior segments of upper lobe with bilateral effusion. So there was a possibility of fungal infection and fungal pneumonia. We have sent galactomannan and we started him on prophylactic antifungal. So now do you think we should give a weaning trial to this patient?
Yes, ma'am.
No.
Okay. Should we give weaning trial on day 6 or should we give weaning trial on day 7?
Ma'am, day 7.
Okay. Anybody wants to give on day 6? Anybody who doesn't want to give on day 7 and still wants to wait?
Ma'am, what was the culture report, ma'am? ET culture?
It is just sent on day 5, so it will take 48 hours to come. Okay, let's see what happens. So on day 7, we gave a weaning trial by pressure support ventilation and patient tolerated well. But we then put the patient on TP's trial, which the patient failed, and the patient was put back on the volume control. ET culture showed Acinetobacter and antibiotics were changed accordingly. Now the question is, why did we give TP's trial to this patient? So The reason why I've chosen this case specifically is because this is a normal tendency and a practice in the ICUs that whenever you put a patient on a weaning trial, especially the pressure support ventilation, and patient tolerates the weaning trial well, the consultants usually push the junior doctors or the residents that okay, patient is maintaining well, now put on TPs. Agreed?
Yes, ma'am.
Yes, ma'am.
So that was the reason why we gave the TPs trial and patient failed. So unfortunately, on day 7, we were not able to extubate the patient. On day 8, now we changed the strategy of weaning. We weaned him on pressure support ventilation. Patient tolerated well. We extubated the patient and we put him on NIV support. Now, why do you think the patient, we extubated him on NIV support?
Because he's
Ma'am,
COPD.
still
Multiple organ involved.
Yes, so
still has the
underlying
primary problem.
COPD, that is very, very good because COPD patients, they usually require some sort of pressure support ventilation even after extubation because of their deranged physiology and pathophysiology. So that was the reason why patient was able to tolerate the weaning trial on pressure support ventilation. But as soon as we put them on TP's trial, they fail. So the strategy which we adapted was intermittent NIV plus oxygen depending on patient's condition. And then we were able to discharge this patient on day 16. So why this is important is first we have to do risk stratification in these patients when once we are planning for extubation, whether they are low risk, whether they are intermediate risk, whether they are high risk. So this patient was a high risk patient. He had more than 3-4 comorbidities. Even though patient was not obese, but patient had underlying COPD, so there would be some amount of CO2 retention at the end of spontaneous breathing trial. So these patients will definitely require NIV after extubation. Clear?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. Next case. So this was a 74-year male, known case of hypertension who presented with chest pain and perspiration since 1 hour. On arrival, patient comes in cardiac arrest. We did a CPR and ROSC was achieved after 10 minutes. Patient was intubated and put on ventilator support with volume control mode and settings of 420 of tidal volume, rate of 18 p per 5 and FiO2 of 100% initially. These were the initial vitals. Heart rate was around 52. Patient was hypotensive. Saturation was 99% on 100% of FiO2. Chest shows diffuse bilateral crepitations. Since he was hypotensive, we started him on adrenaline and non-adrenaline infusions. ECG was suggestive of acute anterior wall MI, which was STEMI. So immediately we shifted the patient to cath lab. We did an angiography which showed triple vessel disease. We did a rescue PTC of culprit LAD and we planned a staged PCI later. Fentanyl for the patient was on ventilator. We secured various lines. We did a chest X-ray which showed bilateral perihilar opacities. We managed patients with dual antiplatelets, GP2B3 inhibitors, antibiotics, diuretics, and antacids. I mean, this is the standard protocol which almost all the ICUs follows whenever a patient comes like this. This is the initial investigations, some amount of leukocytosis because post cardiac arrest. This was an ABG just immediately after ROSC, so there was CO2 retention. We changed the ventilator settings accordingly. We did a 2D echo which showed anteroapical akinesia with some segments of hypokinesia, LV systolic dysfunction, EF of around 30% with moderate PAH, RVSP of 62. So now on day 2, patient develops AF with fast ventricular rate. We started him on amiodarone infusion. Day 3, patient develops fever spikes. So we sent an ET culture, antibiotics were escalated. We did a chest X-ray which shows increased ground glass opacities in the bilateral regions with both CP angles blunted. And now patient goes into oliguria. We did a nephrology reference. Initially, he suggested for dietary infusion. So these were the problems which we were dealing with in this patient. Patient had persistent fever. He was on very high inotropic support. Patient developed AKI, creatinine increased, and this was a typical case of difficult weaning. So how do you think we should go about in this patient? Should we wait for the patient to recover? Should we plan for early tracheostomy? What would be your take on this patient?
Ma'am, we
We
should
should wait,
wait
ma'am.
We
since
should
high
wait, ma'am.
inotropic support is there.
Okay. So let's see what happens. Over next 48 to 72 hours, patient gradually starts improving. So yeah, that is the right thing because this patient has come with cardiac arrest. We are able to revive the patient. Patient has no hypoxic brain injury. We did an angioplasty at the correct timing. So we have to give some time for the recovery. So on day 7, there is no fever, urine output improves, inotropes are gradually tapered off, and adrenaline is stopped. We did an HRCT thorax, which showed some ground glass opacities in bilateral lower zones with collapse consolidation. ET culture shows Klebsiella. So now, already 7 days on ventilator, patient is showing improvement. There are minimal inotropes now. Do you want to wean this patient?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, which day? Day 7, or you want to wean on day 8?
Day 8,
Day 8,
ma'am.
ma'am.
8.
Why not on 7? On day
Because
7, there is no fever, the urine output is improved, inotropes are gradually tapered. We can give a sedation vacation and we can plan for weaning
Also,
trial.
Because
respiratory.
ET culture show
but
the Klebsiella pneumoniae.
Klebsiella
And we have
pneumonia,
just
you have not
That
started
culture was sent
antibiotic yet.
3 days back.
Yeah,
So
but
So,
that
okay, if the ET culture shows Klebsiella pneumonia, will that Klebsiella pneumonia go on day 8?
but the HRCT is showing ground glass opacity. Like,
So that will resolve in 24 hours?
no, ma'am.
So what do you want to do?
a day 9 weaning trial.
Day 9 weaning trial. So what do you want to do for next 48 hours?
Ma'am, we will be escalating the antibiotic.
Escalation of the antibiotics.
So Klebsiella pneumonia is already sensitive to the empirical antibiotics.
Oh, then we will not change.
Okay.
Okay.
Ma'am, what is the status of noradrenaline? Do we stop it or
Minimal support. Adrenaline has been stopped. NORAD is on minimal support. There is
Ma'am,
no
if
fever.
the lung pathology is improving in next
The extent of
Ma'am, what
pleural
about
48
effusion.
hours,
ABG?
then we can go for the weaning trial.
we can give the winning trial to on day 7?
Ma'am, what about the ABG?
ABGs are okay.
Still, there is bilateral effusion, so we should wait for
No, the
still
extent
patient
of
getting
pleural
negative,
effusion.
and then we should try for winning.
So should we give a spontaneous breathing trial or we should not give a spontaneous breathing trial? Forget about whether the patient will tolerate it or not tolerate it.
We
Yes,
can
ma'am,
give
we can give.
We
We
should
should
give.
try,
on day 7.
but do
Day
not
8 we can
extubate.
give.
Okay. Let's see what we did. So on day 7, we gave a weaning trial with pressure support ventilation, which the patient failed. So what happened? Once we put the patient on ventilator support, patient develops hypoxia. So we had to increase the FiO2. And with hypoxia, patient develops hemodynamic instability. So obviously the inotropes goes up. So now what do you want to do? Day 8, do you want to give weaning trial?
No, ma'am, as inotropic
No,
support
as
has
the
been
inotrope
increased, we should
increased,
wait for at least 48 hours again.
The requirement is also increased.
Yes. So on day 8, we break for 24 hours. We let the parameters to settle down. And then on day 9, we can plan for a weaning trial. So this patient, we gave a weaning trial on day 9, which patient tolerated well. And we extubated the patient again on NIV support. Does anybody want to go in for tracheostomy in this patient?
No, ma'am.
No, ma'am.
Not at this point of time, ma'am.
Okay. So on day 9, chest X-ray is improving, creatinine is improving. Patient was managed with intermittent NIV and oxygen, and patient was discharged on day 15. So this is how we plan the strategies of putting the patient on spontaneous breathing trial. We consider whether the patient is tolerating the trial or not tolerating the trial. What are the parameters if the patient is failing the trial, and how differently we can now go ahead with the next trials so that we are able to successfully extubate the patient.
Ma'am, but how did the patient actually? I want to ask a question that on day 8, patient failed, but on day 9, patient tolerated well here.
Yeah. So basically what happened is we changed the ventilator strategies to deal with the lung condition. So patient had bilateral pleural effusion. So we over next 48 hours we had to do negative balance for the patient so that the lungs are deloaded. Then the ventilator strategies of giving, adequate amount of PEEP to improve the oxygenation status. So all those things, these are, little things which at the bedside you'll be able to assess and you will be able to work upon them so that how differently you will be able to manage the patient. And then that is what I said. What are the parameters on which the patient failed? What exactly happened? How did you manage? And how differently now you can give a pressure support ventilation trial or a spontaneous breathing trial so that patients gets extubated successfully. The end goal is that we should be able to extubate the patient successfully, right? But at the same time, we should not be in a hurry to just extubate the patient.
Okay, ma'am. But if the patient again failed the at day 9, so
Then you have to go back to the same
it
setting.
will be the criteria to get the tracheostomy done.
See, there is no criteria that if the patient fails 2 spontaneous breathing trials or 3 spontaneous breathing trials, so that is the criteria for tracheostomy. No. Again, we have to see what is the underlying cause of failing of spontaneous breathing trial. In this case, it was just the hemodynamic instability. If the underlying cause is something which will going to require a long-term ventilator support, or the patient has developed ventilator dependency because of some diaphragmatic dysfunction or anything like that, or in a chronically ill patient develops critical illness myoneuropathy. So those are the patients, but on those patients, it cannot be on day 9. Those are long-term patients, neuro patients. So, or patients who are coming with neuromuscular disorders, patient is coming with GBS. So
Okay.
those patients, we know that they will require long-term ventilator support. So we can think about tracheostomy. In this patient, even on day 9, if the patient fails the spontaneous breathing trial, we have to see, analyze what are the parameters which were deranged at the time of spontaneous breathing trial and whether they are reversible or not. Remember, we talked about the weaning barriers.
Yes, ma'am.
Yeah, so
And
we have
if in between the patient is the thick secretions are there and the tube is partially blocked or something
then you have to
till day
see.
9, so is it required to change the endotracheal tube in between?
Yes, of course. Because if you just extubate the patient because of a blocked tube, maybe the patient has not recovered with the underlying lung condition. Maybe patient requires some sort of ventilatory support. Blocked tube is not the criteria of extubation. If your
Thank you.
tube is blocked, you have to change the tube. So weaning criteria is a very robust criteria. It has to be done in a very systematic manner. You have to analyze each and every parameter, whether the patient is fulfilling everything, patient is hemodynamically stable, the ABGs are stable, patient has a good respiratory effort, the secretions are not very much, they are not thick purulent secretions, the amount of secretions are less, there is no hemodynamic instability, no arrhythmias, no hypotension. All of them account into one thing, and then you have to go ahead with extubation. Okay? There's
Thank
just
you.
one more case if you want to discuss. So this is a 76-year-old female, known case of diabetes, hypertension, old CV stroke, PCA infarct, now develops sudden onset of loss of consciousness following an episode of vomiting after having breakfast. On arrival, GCS was 7/15. She had right-sided weakness. Bilateral pupils were unequal. Right was normal size reacting to light. Left was semi-dilated, not reacting to light. Patient was hemodynamically stable. We immediately intubated the patient because patient had low GCS with inability to protect the airway. Patient was put on volume control. We did a CT brain which showed large frontotemporal ICA with IVH. There was a midline shift of around 14 mm with mass effect and uncal herniation on left side and acute SAH. Initial investigations was fairly okay, just mild leukocytosis. Others, everything was okay. We underwent an emergent left frontotemporoparital decompressive cranectomy with evacuation of ICH. We gave blood transfusion, managed with
We
antibiotics.
can't see some Siri shortcut is coming. Can you hide it, please?
Sorry, what is coming?
coming. Others can also see this, right?
No.
I think the
Now,
screen is pretty clear.
oh
It's
yes,
probably.
now it's sorry, it was from my side. I'm so sorry.
Okay. So, antibiotics, antiepileptics, mannitol, fluid, antacids, antihypertensives. We initially gave labetalol infusion. We started with nimotipine. Day 2, labetalol was stopped. GCS persistently, E2, VT, M4 with right hemiparesis. We repeated the CT brain after the surgery. There was the midline shift reduced to 7.5 mm with decreased mass effect. Now, day 3, there was slight improvement in the GCS with E3, VT, M5. Patient has right hemiparesis. Pupils are still unequal. Routine blood investigations within normal limits. What do you think? Should we give a weaning trial or not?
Yes,
No,
ma'am.
ma'am.
No,
We should
ma'am.
do tracheostomy.
Tracheostomy.
No.
Why tracheostomy?
Ma'am,
Ma'am,
not
low
on day
The airway
GCS.
protection that was
Patient is
used.
conscious. Look at the GCS.
Ma'am,
Patient is
said, ma'am, we should give the weaning trial.
Who wants to do tracheostomy and why? Please justify. Who said tracheostomy first? It's okay even if you're wrong. We are just
Me, ma'am, because patient has still low GCS and because she has ICH, SH, it will take a
that
longer
we've already
duration.
operated. That ICH IVH has been operated. Now the GCS has improved. Look at the GCS. It is 8T.
But it is M5, no, ma'am.
It is?
Motor power is only 5.
Yeah. So patient is drowsy, but patient is able to localize the painful stimulus.
Ma'am,
So
people is
But
unequal still.
she won't be able to protect her airway maybe if we extubate.
Ma'am, people is still unequal.
that will remain unequal. Okay, let's see how we proceeded. So we gave a weaning trial to this patient. That was a pressure support ventilation. Patient tolerated well. But since this is a neuro patient, we will not just go, in that, rapid rush manner. So the consultant decided that throughout the day, patient maintained on pressure support ventilation. Overnight, we had to put the patient on volume control. And we thought that maybe next day, if the patient is improving even better than this, then we'll plan for an extubation, because obviously neuro patients we have to go a little slow. Now on day 4 we gave a pressure support ventilation trial and patient failed. What do you think could have happened?
Patient may develop new sort of changes in the X-ray or the changes in the GCS.
Some imaging is, ma'am, neuroimaging is required, CT.
Yes. So especially neurological patients, we have to look at the GCS and we have to see whenever a patient deteriorates clinically, we again have to go in for a new imaging. So on day 4, the reason why I initially wrote trial failed and then wrote the parameters was because I wanted to see how will you approach to this patient. So on day 4, there was a deterioration in the GCS, and rest patient continues to have right hemiparesis with pupils being unequal. We gave a trial, but patient failed the weaning trial. We did an urgent CT brain, and along with the previous findings, patient now develops new hypodensity in the right temporal and occipital lobes. So now patient is developing new infarcts in the PCA territory. We managed with the hypertonic saline, mannitol was stopped. So now how do you want to go about in this patient?
We should go for
Ma'am,
So this is
tracheostomy.
day 4. Okay, day 4 now we see that patient is failing the weaning trial. Patient has now developed new infarcts. So do you want to wait for at least next, few days? You again want to give a weaning trial, or you just straight away want to go for tracheostomy?
Ma'am, we will
We can
wait
wait
for
for
Tracheostomy,
2
ma'am.
days,
48
ma'am.
hours.
48 hours.
Yes.
48 hours we can wait.
Yes.
Tracheostomy.
Okay. the person who wants to wait for 48 hours, what will you do in next 48 hours? And how do you think the
We
patient
can,
will improve in next 48 hours?
ma'am, we can wait for her improvement, GCS.
Okay, so a patient who is already an old stroke patient, comes with ICH, a huge ICH with IVH, already being operated, now develops new infarcts. Do you think patient will improve neurologically in 48 hours?
No.
No.
So
No.
see,
Early
the reason
tracheostomy.
why we are discussing these cases is we have to make an approach to the patient. We have to think long term. What are the reversible weaning barriers we can do? So any neurological insult, will it improve in next 48 hours?
No, ma'am.
In
It
this
takes
patient,
months.
what is the cause of weaning failure? Is it the hemodynamic instability?
No new
It is the
neurological
rest.
insult.
Yeah, so it is a new
It is the
neurological.
ICP.
So new neurological insult, even though we are dealing with, these parameters, patient has increased edema, we have started hypertonic saline, we started other parameters. But do you think patient will improve significantly next 48 hours?
No,
So
ma'am.
that we will be
No,
able to
ma'am.
wean the patient?
No.
Go
No.
for early tracheostomy.
Yes. So these are the kind of patients where we have to plan and think about early tracheostomy. And on tracheostomy also we can wean the patient from the ventilator, right? Same
Yes, ma'am.
parameter, same way, same thing will follow.
Yes, ma'am.
Only with that we are doing with ET tube, now we have to do with the tracheostomy tube. So on day 5, we go in for tracheostomy. On day 6, patient has fever spikes. Patient develops electrolyte imbalances, which were corrected. And we now started giving intermittent PSV trials, which patient was tolerating well. And now look at the MRI brain with MRI angiography. So it showed large craniotomy defects. There were infarcts in the right temporal and bilateral occipital lobes. There was a midline shift of 3 mm. And look at the MRI angio report. There is occlusion of the left ICA, complete occlusion of M1 of left MCA, stenosis of P3 and P4 segment of left PCA, and near complete occlusion of right PCA, and moderate to severe stenosis of left CCA. So basically, and near complete occlusion of left IC. So basically, everywhere there are multiple occlusions, right? So in these kind of patients, the neurological recovery will be very slow. We cannot predict how long and how much the patient will be able to recover neurologically. So a week later, we tried with TP's trial. Patient tolerated well. Patient was put on intermittent TP's trial. The GCS came back to E3, VT, M5, remained the same throughout, and then patient was referred to the neuro rehabilitation center. Thank you. So did you understand how all the 3 cases were different? The first was a COPD patient, the second was a cardiac patient in post-cardiac arrest status, and third was a neurological patient. And how do we have to approach to them for weaning trials, and how, post-weaning, how do we plan the post-extubation strategies, whether we have to put them on NIV, whether we have to put them on oxygen support, what will be their course of action